In so many ways, the United States has lived into that original promise of being a healthy, religiously diverse democracy. And I think it's important to recognize that when that framework was being developed by the European founders of the 1776 generation, political theorists believed it was impossible. In fact, they believed it was impossible for centuries. If you wanted a democracy, you had to have a homogeneous population, and the most important identity for everybody to share was religion. So when Franklin, and Jefferson, and Madison, and Adams, and Washington came along and said, actually, we can have a country where people from the four corners of the earth come praying to God in different ways, including not at all, and they can build out of this patch of land a nation. And it can be a nation where those people engage each other with respect, with positive relationships, with cooperation. That was thought of as impossible. And as the United States has become more and more religiously diverse, in fact, we're the most religiously diverse nation in human history, and the most religiously devout nation in the Western Hemisphere, I think we have lived into the bulk of that promise. There is more work to be done. The prejudice against Muslims, the resurgence of anti-Semitism, the way that atheists and secular humanists are still dismissed in too much of American political life, these are problems. But we have so much to build from, to be proud of, to grow from. And we need to realize that being a healthy, religiously diverse democracy is at the center of the American experiment. So many of the European colonists who settle along the eastern seaboard are connected to the combatants of the European wars of religion. And part of what the vanguard intellectual and architect generation thinks about, and I'm thinking of people like Washington and Madison and Adams and Jefferson, for all of their sins and mistakes, and those were legion, and they should not be forgotten, right? The fact that these men were slaveholders, that should not be forgotten. They got several things right. And one of the things that they got right was this idea that people who oriented around religion differently could live together in a nation and actually make that nation stronger. And this was not just ancillary to the American project from that late 18th century generation. This was actually at the center of it. These founders said that they would welcome these people from different religious backgrounds. Ben Franklin builds a hall in Philadelphia and says that the pulpit of the hall would be open to people preaching Islam. He makes donations to every religious community in Philadelphia and says that he only wants them to celebrate July 4th together and to commemorate his funeral together. These individuals, who again made so many mistakes on other dimensions of identity, got religious diversity largely right, and they set a North Star that is still worth achieving today. And one of my favorite statements along these lines is Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, in which he says his government will give to bigotry no sanction and to persecution no assistance, that the children of the stock of Abraham should feel safe sitting under their own vine and fig. There should be none to make them afraid. There he is quoting the prophet Micah, right? This notion of a healthy, religiously diverse democracy that would welcome Jews, right? A group of people who were hated and hounded and harassed for centuries in Europe. The status of free exercise is quite strong in the courts. The Supreme Court over and over again has ruled in favor of particular religious communities when they bring cases around religious freedom issues to court. But I think its status is more tenuous in the culture. My organization, Interfaith America, recently did a survey of higher education institutions, the largest such survey done in recent memory about religious diversity in higher education. And what we discovered was that various identity issues were paid a lot of attention to in higher ed. 2/3 to 3/4 of students said that they spent a lot of time thinking and talking and studying about race and gender and sexuality and ideology, hugely important dimensions of American life. But fewer than half said they spent any time at all studying religious identity and diversity. That feels to me to be malpractice of education. It's like going to medical school and not learning about the circulatory system. First of all, to learn about the religious identities of your fellow citizens, people who you're going to be meeting in business settings or in medical settings or in educational settings, you ought to know something about the religious identities of people. But secondly, the American tradition of free exercise of religion, of being a religiously diverse democracy, that part of the American experiment, which again is central, it's not ancillary, it's central. To not appreciate that in our culture, to not appreciate that in our educational institutions, that's something that we really need to correct. It's clear to me that there's a lot of attention to the parts of religion that have hurt people. And these are important parts. We should not ignore the ways that gay folks have been negatively impacted by certain religious messages. We should not ignore the ways that women are too often subordinate in religious settings. But this is not the whole story. One of the things that I do when I begin my speeches is I say, let's do a mental experiment. Imagine if all of the faith-based, faith-founded, faith-inspired institutions in your city disappeared overnight. Let's take a walk in the morning and see what would be missing. And it turns out that it's not just the churches, synagogues, and mosques that are missing, not just places where people worship, but also the hospitals, the preschools, the social service centers, the law schools, the colleges, because religion is the source and inspiration of something like half of American civil society. There are 120 Methodist colleges and universities in the United States: Syracuse, Emory, Duke, USC. There are 230 Catholic colleges and universities: Georgetown, Notre Dame, Loyola Chicago, Loyola Maryland, Loyola New Orleans, Loyola Marymount. Southern Baptists train about as many disaster relief volunteers as the Red Cross. If there's an earthquake, if there's a hurricane, if there's a tornado in your area, and all the faith-inspired institutions in America have disappeared overnight, there might not be anybody showing up at your door to provide you a safe place to sleep and a warm meal. And that's the kind of work that faith communities do. And I think it ought to be appreciated, and I think it ought to be supported, and at the very least, we ought to pay attention to the history of a nation that has said the American promise is you will have free exercise of religion. The American genius is that when people are given freedom to express their identity, particularly their religious identity, they use that freedom to build institutions, schools, colleges, hospitals that serve everybody. I think that that's remarkable. I think that that's something that our culture should center. One of the remarkable things about these institutions of higher education founded by faith communities is they've become places where interfaith cooperation and religious pluralism thrive. Now, I wish that the presence of their historic faith identity was more salient. Having said that, if you go to a Yale, or if you go to a Harvard, or if you go to a Northwestern, what you will find is thriving communities of people from different religions, oftentimes doing positive interfaith cooperation projects together. And frequently, it is the dean of religious life, the person hired by the university as part of the continuity of the historic faith community that founded that university, who will be supporting those kinds of programs. I think that that's a really positive thing, particularly when it is clear that that dean of religious life is doing it as part of a theology of interfaith cooperation of their Congregationalist or Methodist or Catholic or Unitarian faith. I think this notion of emphasizing that our different religions inspire us to cooperate with people who believe differently, I think that that's really important in a religiously diverse democracy, and I think that universities have an opportunity to model that, and many of them, in fact, are. The fact that our ideologies, our religious traditions are going to have different ideas of the good life, the healthy life, the holy life, I think that that's obvious and clear. We still need to find ways to respect, relate, cooperate. We still need to find ways to strengthen the civic and political community within which we all live, right? And so there are ways in which one can live out one's own religious identity that doesn't overtly disdain other identities, whether that's atheist or gay or Muslim or whatever else. We have to find ways to respect, relate, cooperate. We can live with our differences. We can recognize that some of those differences are deep disagreements, and we have to realize that just as we bridge rivers to get across them, we need to bridge our cultural and religious divides so that we maintain this sense of wholeness as a diverse democracy. I think the parts of the American story that inspire me the most is when the mainstream culture of the United States widens to include people who maybe the mainstream culture a generation ago didn't think could be included. So the Catholic example is the most striking to me here. For generations and generations, Catholics were a group that experienced profound prejudice. And there was literally this notion that if you have a pope, if you have priests, if you have nuns, you can't be part of the United States of America. In fact, some might say that the United States launches as an anti-Catholic project. Who was John Winthrop escaping in England? Catholic influence in the Anglican Church. And it really is only in the late 1920s that a concerted civic movement to include Catholics emerges. And that's only really after a time of deep, ugly anti-Catholic prejudice in the KKK era of the 1920s. I think one of the most inspiring and undertold stories in American history is how Catholics go from hated group to really mainstream. So mainstream that during a time in the early 2010s, the entire presidential line of succession, Vice President, Secretary of State, Speaker of the House, and a majority of the Supreme Court were all Catholic, and nobody was raising the alarm bells. What happens? What happens is that American culture expands to include Catholics as part of the mainstream. American culture, in a way, catches up with the vision of the founders. So George Washington was friends with Bishop John Carroll in Washington, D.C. George Washington reprimanded the leadership of his army when anti-Catholic events took place in the Continental Army. The vision of the European founders was far ahead of American culture for hundreds of years. After the first Catholic to run for president on a major party ticket, Al Smith, who runs as a Democrat for president in 1928, after his campaign is torpedoed by anti-Catholic rhetoric, a civic group emerges called the National Conference of Christians and Jews, the NCCJ, and they invent a term which would make America more inclusive for the growing religious minorities of Jews and Catholics. That term has become so mainstream today that we forget that somebody invented it. The term is Judeo-Christian America. Up until that time, the United States had thought of itself as a Protestant nation. Franklin Roosevelt famously said, "This is a Protestant country and the Jews and Catholics are here under sufferance." It was this civic group responding to anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism that emerges and says, actually, we're not just for Protestants. We are for Jews and Catholics also, and the term that we will invent that denotes that is Judeo-Christian. The United States now has significant minority communities from Islam, from Hinduism, from Buddhism, growing Jain and Confucian and Baha'i and Sikh communities, obviously a growing secular humanist, atheist population. Judeo-Christian did good work for a century. It's time, we think, for the next chapter in the great story of American religious diversity. The thing that I love the most about the free exercise of religion is that it's the essential component of diversity. It's the seed from which you get religiously diverse democracy. There's no such thing as diversity if particularity is not cherished and protected. If people are not allowed to express their identity, whether in a manner of prayer or in a form of worship or in the building of their own faith communities, you don't have diversity. You have homogeneity. And the thing that is so powerful about diversity is that people from different identities get to make their own distinctive contributions. We here at Interfaith America don't talk about America as a melting pot. We talk about America as a potluck nation, a nation that welcomes, invites, indeed depends upon the distinctive contributions of multiple communities. I mean, what a nightmare if you bring your best dish to the potluck and you're met by a giant melting machine that melts it into the same goo as everybody else's best dish. The only way you have a potluck is if people from different identities, different backgrounds, different cultures and cuisines bring their best dish to the table. And there are creative combinations that can be made, and then the whole nation feasts. We all have a stake in being a healthy, religiously diverse democracy. And atheists, agnostics, spiritual seekers, secular humanists, their free exercise rights are just as important as evangelical Christians or Orthodox Catholics or Sunni Muslims or Reformed Jews. All of us have free exercise rights. You have a free exercise right to start a secular humanist society, or to not go to church, or to sit down while somebody else is praying. You have free exercise rights. Your identity counts. And because your identity counts, you ought to have a stake in somebody else's identity counting, because you want to be able to express your identity as an evangelical Christian or as a secular humanist. You have a stake in protecting the identities and practice of other people. That's what it means to have a diverse democracy. It means that we have a stake in the well-being and in the freedom of other people. And we have a stake in our relationship with other people, and we have a stake in cooperating across the divide. I think the American experiment of free exercise of religion and building a healthy, religiously diverse democracy is amongst the most inspiring stories, literally, in human history. Again, people for centuries thought that this was impossible, that if you wanted to have diversity, you had to have a dictatorship. And if you wanted a democracy, it had to be a homogeneous population of which religion was the most important shared identity. What we are doing here is impossible. Impossible. The notion that you could have people praying to God in different ways and still having a stake in each other's freedom, still protecting each other's houses of worship, still relating across lines of difference, still cooperating across the ideological and doctrinal divide. That is remarkable. We should protect that. We should cherish it. We should teach about it. We should extend it. We should know what has gone in the past, and we should build from strength to strength into the future.